Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Delta Dialogues. This is your monthly call for the integrated photonics community. My name is Johan Smeets, and I'll be your host today. Last month, we had an interesting session live from San Francisco, where we were attending the Photonics West exhibition. Together with 16 different companies, we took a look at some of the startups that were on the pavilion, and we had a nice interview with Madison Railing from the Optonique Photonics cluster in Canada. Today, we are going to talk about a feasibility study that was conducted recently by the Roland Berger consulting company. So why are we going to address this topic today? Because as Photon Delta, we cannot scale the integrated photonics industry just as the Netherlands alone, right? So we need to work together and unify our strengths with European partners in order to realize our ambitions. Therefore, it's mandatory to look at, okay, what are the market volumes, what is the competitive landscape, what is the value chain, and how can we together create the future of the integrated photonics industry. I would like to introduce you to our speaker today. So we have here live in the studio Darwin Rajpal. He is a senior consultant of Roland Berger that was actively involved in the study that will be presented today. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat so that we can look at them and ask them to Rajpal after the presentation. Also, please note that you will receive a summary of the report in your mailbox shortly next week, probably. Rajpal, if you can please make your way to the presentation side. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction, Johan. Good afternoon, everyone. Maybe good morning for the people from the other parts, not in Europe. The idea, I'm Darwin, like Johan mentioned, and the idea is today, in the next 30 minutes, to walk you through our study on the feasibility of a European PIC Foundry. This presentation will mainly cover 5 key aspects. We'll start our presentation focusing on the market demand for PICs. What role would integration play in this market demand? How does EU as a strategic advantage play a role within the PIC landscape? What kind of positioning does Netherlands have in this PIC landscape? And finally, we'll talk a bit and conclude our presentation on the value chain positioning. Before we deep dive into each of these aspects, I would like to quickly run through the key messages of each of these sections so that you remember these messages when you're discussing these, when we are deep diving into each of these sections. So to start with market, PIC market currently is still in its infancy, but it is expected to grow very rapidly in the coming years with an expected volume of roughly close to 1 to 2 billion PICs by 2040. Within this growth, all the platforms, mainly the key platforms which are indium phosphide, silicon nitride, as well as silicon photonics, are expected to stay relevant in the next coming years. Going to the integration, majority of the applications will have combination of platforms within a PIC, and as a result of this, integration technologies will be a key in the future of PIC production, and hence a foundry needs to have this integration within itself to have a strategic advantage. Looking at the position of EU, what you see is PICs would be used in many applications, among which few are very critical to Europe as a continent, and that's why EU should take a stake in the production and assembly of PICs to make sure there is security of supply and economic power going forward. Looking at the positioning of Netherlands is very strong within indium phosphide as well as silicon nitride. It has companies that covers the entire value chain of the PIC ecosystem, and hence it's very ideally suited to have a foundry for both of these platforms within Netherlands. And finally, when you look at the value chain positioning, to encourage widespread adoption of PICs in the short to mid term, you need to offer a value chain approach, so a one-stop shop kind of a solution to make sure the PICs are going towards a very high growth trajectory. So with these key messages, let's start deep diving into our sections. First, we'll start with market demand for PICs. Before going into the market demand, I would like to quickly run through the platforms that we are focusing in our study. Currently, we are focusing on 3 platforms, so mainly indium phosphide, silicon nitride, and silicon photonics. Each of these platforms have its own strengths and their applicabilities. For example, if you look at indium phosphide, they are very good in active components such as lasers and modulators, whereas silicon nitride are very good in waveguides. So it's very easy to realize low loss waveguides in silicon nitride. When you also talk about applicability, you see that silicon nitride can be used also from, let's say, around 700, 800 nanometers to roughly 4,000, 3,500 nanometers, whereas silicon photonics as well as indium phosphide can be used between 1,000 to 1,500 kind of nanometer range. So each of the platforms have different applicabilities in terms of wavelength and different strengths and disadvantages. And hence we see going forward that majority of the applications will have multiple combinations of these platforms or technologies like we call them within a PIC setup. Once we introduce these platforms, what we want to say is how do we actually size this market? Like I mentioned before, PICs are still currently in initial stages. They have grown with a CAGR of 80% in the last few years. But what you see is that majority of application is still optical communication. Use of PICs other than optical communication is very minimal currently. And as a result, it's very difficult to predict how the adoption of PICs are going to look like going forward. So we use a scenario-based approach. In a scenario-based approach, you can see that multiple scenarios exist where the growth of PIC is based on the relevance of PIC in a very specific application. So we start with, in our current study, a base case which is based on market reports for short to mid-term, so let's say up to 2025, 2026. And after that, we do a very conservative estimate of use of PICs in an application other than optical communication. So such as sensing, you can say LIDAR, consumer electronics or biomedical sensing. Then we have accelerated scenarios where you see that the PICs are more aggressively adopted in applications other than optical communications and also within optical communication. So there you can see that the growth of PIC would be on top of what we predict in base case. Before we deep dive into the numbers, I would like to first quickly run you how do we actually segment this market. So like I mentioned before, a PIC platform has a PIC platform will have multiple technologies integrated together. So what we then segment that platform as a whole is into 2 parts. One, a PIC technology, which will be the core platform, and a PIC technology, which would be a supporting platform. A core platform is a platform where majority of the elements are realized, and in a supporting platform, maybe some external components or supporting elements of the PIC will be realized. So to give an example, if you talk about an INP as a core platform, it could be that within an indium phosphide platform, you'll have majority of the active components such as lasers, modulators, and detectors modeled. And the waveguides, so the low loss waveguides would be modeled in a silicon nitride platform. So a PIC platform would be a combination of indium phosphide and silicon nitride, but within that you'll have a core platform of indium phosphide supported by silicon nitride or maybe silicon photonics as a supporting platform. So we first try to size the market looking at only the core platforms, and then later on we see what would be the market demand for this supporting platforms and to come to an overall market demand for PICs as a whole. So to start with market demand for PICs as a core platform. Here you see a base case PIC demand estimation where you see by 2030 roughly as a core platform PICs there is a demand of 150 to 200 million PIC chips. Going towards 2040 that demand is expected to rise roughly between 650 to 700 million. Again as a core platform, and here like I mentioned before, base case mainly optical communications would be the key driver for the PIC demand. Going after 2030, you would see some adoption of PICs in applications other than communication, such as LIDAR and consumer electronics. But even in 2040, we expect optical communications to be 50% of the total demand. So that's the base case. Going forward, like we mentioned, now we do a scenario-based approach and we assume 3 scenarios here. a scenario A, where you can see that already within the optical communication, there is more aggressive adoption of PICs there. And when you say aggressive adoption, we say both in data centers as well as in telecommunications. And because of this aggressive adoption, we can see that by 2040, instead of between 650 to 700 million PIC chips that we predicted in base case, it would rise to roughly 1400 or 1500 million PIC chips. Looking at a scenario B, where we estimate that there would be a very aggressive adoption of PIC within the sensing domain. And when I say sensing, it comprises of LIDAR, it comprises of consumer electronics such as watches or wearables or fitness bands, and it comprises of biomedical sensing for health purposes. So if you assume that there would be a widespread adoption in these applications, you can expect that the PIC demand can leap forward from 670 or 650 in base case to roughly 1800 in the aggressive scenario B. And then finally, there is scenario C, where other than sensing and optical communications, there is adoption of PICs in other applications such as AR, VR, which can propel the demand for PICs to roughly 4 to 5 times of what you currently see in the base case. In this study, we are mainly focusing on scenario A and B, and we have used detailed bottom-up modeling for each of these applications to see what would be the demand of PICs in each of these applications, A, and which platforms will attract this demand within indium phosphide, silicon photonics, and silicon nitride. To give you a quick example of how we actually model our market, here I show an example of within sensing, let's say, so aggressive scenario B, I show how do we model the demand of PICs in LIDAR. So what we start with for LIDAR is, of course, LIDARs are mainly going to be used in automotive. Automotive is expected to be 80% of the LIDAR demand in long term. So we start with, let's say, how much new vehicles are going to come in the market going forward. So you see roughly, for example, in 2030, 120 new vehicles are expected to be sold. In that new vehicles, what would be the penetration of LIDAR? You see that right now, or in short term, we expect the LIDAR penetration to be roughly around 10%, but going towards 2040, that could rise up to 60%. And then within LIDAR, how much percentage of LIDAR would be driven by PICs? PICs technology, and we expect that by 2040, 100% of the LIDAR, so that's a very aggressive scenario, 100% of the LIDAR would be driven by PICs, and then we assume that within one LIDAR you'll have 4 PICs chip. So to finally come to a demand of PIC chips in LIDAR, you see that by 2030 you would roughly have 36 to 40 million PIC chips being used for LIDAR application in automotive, and that number would rise to roughly 300 million by 2040. Now, once we have this demand, we would like to then see what is the share of different platforms or different technologies within this LIDAR application. So you can see that here we assume that all the 3 platforms will have roughly an equal share. The reason for this is that in LIDAR, currently you see that majority of the application is in 905 nanometer range, but going forward you see more and more applications coming in 50 and 50 nanometer range because of the safety for the long range applications. So we expect going forward that both these wavelengths would be relevant, and then for example silicon nitride is capable enough to operate within the 905 nanometer range, whereas silicon photonics and indium phosphide would be more geared towards 1550, where silicon photonics could have an advantage because it's highly compatible with the current CMOS process. So each technology has its strength within the LIDAR space, and as a result, we expect that all the 3 platforms would maybe have an equal share for LIDAR applications. Similarly, like LIDAR, we did this bottom-up modeling for consumer electronics, for biomedical sensing, for data centers, as well as for telecommunications. And if you look at the results, so if you look, we have 2 scenarios like we mentioned. In scenario A, we see by 2040 roughly 1400 million chips of PICs being in demand, among which optical communication would be the key driver. Whereas in scenario B, you see roughly 1800 million chips because of widespread adoption in sensing. So 80% of the PIC market would be driven by sensing, among which 45% will be contributed by consumer electronics, so watches and wearables. If you then look at how would be the share of platforms or technologies within this demand, you see that in scenario A, as optical communication was really leading the demand there, and silicon photonics has a big role to play in data centers, we see that roughly 55% of the market share, again as a core platform only, will be driven by silicon photonics, followed by indium phosphide and silicon nitride. Again, the stress here is the demand as a core platform. It is very well possible that of the 795 million chips in 2040 for scenario A for silicon photonics, there would be roughly maybe same or lower coming from indium phosphide as a supporting platform. But that we'll delve into the next part. If you focus on scenario B, where sensing was the key aspect and where we said roughly 45% is silicon photonics, and then another 20 to 35% is distributed between silicon nitride as well as indium phosphide. So this basically concludes our section on the market demand for PICs as a core platform. Like I mentioned, the second aspect is looking at the demand coming from the supporting platform, and there integration plays a key role. Because like we mentioned, majority of the applications are gonna have multiple technologies. We divide that into core platform and supporting platform, and the demand for supporting platform depends on what kind of integration technology is gonna be relevant going forward. Right now, as we see it, there are 4 main integration technologies, which can be segmented into 2 buckets, let's say. First is the front-end integration technology, which has monolithic and heterogeneous integration. And then the second bucket is the back-end integration technologies, which has semi-heterogeneous and hybrid integration technologies. Currently, like you see, hybrid integration is at a commercial stage, whereas other technologies, especially heterogeneous and semi-heterogeneous, are more in the pilot or academic stages. Each technology has its advantages depending upon the scale, the cost efficiency, or the integration density. But it's hard to predict which technology or which integration technology is gonna again be relevant going forward, because it depends a lot on the scale or the demand of PICs as well as the technical maturity of each of these technologies. And as a result, again, we use a scenario-based approach where we say in scenario 1, back-end technology will be relevant going forward, as it is also right now currently. Whereas in scenario 2, maybe the scale has expanded to so big that front-end technologies become relevant going forward. Like I said, if the integration technology impacts greatly what would be the demand coming from the supporting platform. To give you an example, if you say a back-end integration technology becomes relevant, in a back-end integration technology, both the chips, so a core platform as well as supporting platform, so take an example of silicon photonics along with indium phosphide, will be manufactured in different foundries, and these chips will then be integrated or assembled together in the packaging stage through either a hybrid or a semi-heterogeneous integration. So here you'll see that there will still be, for every core platform that is manufactured, there would be a supporting chip, a chip from a supporting platform that needs to be manufactured in an independent pure play foundry. If you zoom in now into front-end integration, the idea there is that both supporting as well as core as well as the supporting platform will be manufactured in one foundry or within the setup of one foundry already at a production stage. So there, the need for a different pure play foundry, especially only for supporting platforms, will be diminished. And as a result, the demand for a supporting platform chips being manufactured decreases compared to a back-end integration scenario. And that's why, depending upon which integration scenario becomes relevant going forward, you'll see difference in the demand coming for a supporting PIC platform from a pure play foundry. So this can be now summarized here for these two scenarios, where you see that we have assumed in the short term going towards 2026, the base case scenario is still relevant, and then these effects of different integration scenario starts to play going more to mid to long term. So by 2030, one can expect that in scenario 1, you'll roughly have 400 to 500 million total PICs, including core and supporting platform chips in demand, whereas in scenario 2, like I mentioned, you'll have a front-end integration technology, so the demand for supporting platforms will go down, so the overall PIC volumes being manufactured in a pure play foundry will also go down to roughly 350 million PIC chips. Just to give an example, to a more concrete example, one can look at silicon nitride. And if you look at silicon nitride in 2030, you would see that roughly 45 million chips are used will be in demand as a core platform, and 100 million chips would be in demand as a supporting platform to either an indium phosphide core platform chip or a silicon photonics core platform chip. But the same, if you and in a scenario 1, again, back-end integration technologies will be relevant. So silicon nitride will be manufactured in a different pure play foundry compared to an indium phosphide or a silicon photonics. But in scenario 2, you see that the demand for the core platform is still 45 million chips for silicon nitride, but the demand for supporting platform goes down from 100 to roughly 50 million chips. So that would mean that both silicon nitride as well as silicon photonics, for example, would be manufactured in a same foundry setup, and the need for a silicon nitride as a supporting platform in a different pure play foundry goes down, and that's why you see the overall volume going down. So once now we have estimated the demand of overall PIC chips in 2030 and 2040, the next step is to convert that into wafer volumes. And this step can be tricky because to convert into wafer volume depends a lot on the complexity of the PIC chips, the wafer size, as well as the number of elements that are being realized in that PIC chip or the use case, for example. So there are a lot of ratios that one can use to go from chips to wafer. We have assumed one ratio here, depending upon the platform and the wafer size, but these could be different depending upon the application. So with that assumption, what we say is that for an indium phosphide in 2030, one can expect roughly a wafer volume demand of 100 to 150,000 wafers per annum. Silicon nitride would be a bit lower, roughly 80 to 120,000, whereas silicon photonics would be close to 15 to 20,000. The reason for silicon photonics to be lower compared to silicon nitride or indium phosphide is mainly driven by the wafer size. So silicon photonics is expected to be within 12-inch wafer compared to indium phosphide, which is 6-inch, and also the number of chips realized per wafer for silicon photonics, for example. Converting that into market size, you would see roughly that indium phosphide would be in the range of $3 to $4 billion by 2030, and silicon nitride and silicon photonics would be in the range of $1 billion. So overall, a PIC market by 2030 would be close to $4 to $5 billion, and that number would propel to $5 to $9 billion by 2040. So this concludes our market estimation of PICs for three platforms: indium phosphide, silicon nitride, and silicon photonics. And we have established that there is a demand for these PICs going forward. And now the question is, where does EU play a role in this PIC ecosystem going forward? What you see is that PICs are expected to have a use case in large number of applications, among which automotive, optical communication, computing, and healthcare and medical are key strategic applications for EU prosperity. For example, in automotive, you see companies like BMW, Volvo, Volkswagen being the leader around the world and contributing largely to the European GDP, for example. So these applications would be critical for EU prosperity, and PICs are expected to play a huge role in these applications going forward. If you look at, let's say, the demand per region within these applications, you would see that Europe would roughly have 15 to 20% of the PIC market demand in long term, and that number is quite significant for Europe to have a stake in the integrated PIC value chain. And then the question is, where does Europe have a stake across the value chain of a PIC? To answer that question, we go to the semiconductor industry. If you're taking the inspiration or learnings from the semiconductor industry, Europe, especially in the recent times, had to rely a lot on East to manufacture and produce semiconductor chips, which is not to the strategic advantage of Europe. For example, if you look in automobiles, they had to really rely on China and Taiwan to get their chips, which led to the delays, which was not in their control. And to avoid a scenario like this, Europe needs to have the stake in both production as well as assembly of PICs to have both short-term as well as a long-term strategic advantage. So just to again stress, not only the chip production, but like we said, integration is going to play a key role. So even the chip assembly and packaging needs to be within the key agenda for Europe to have a stake in this PIC ecosystem. And once we have established the strategic importance of EU to play a role within the PICs, the next question is, where does Netherlands play a role in this? What you see is that Netherlands is really strong in indium phosphide and silicon nitride related research. They consistently rank among top 3 in terms of publications in these two platforms around the world. They have companies which span across the entire value chain of PICs. For example, in design, you have companies like Effect or Lyonics. In production, you have Smart Photonics within indium phosphide or Lyonics, also within silicon nitride, and within assembly, you have FIX, for example. So there are companies not only within the PICs value chain, but also like ASML, who would be key companies providing equipments to support the PIC value chain. Especially within, like we said, not only in the academic domain within indium phosphide and silicon nitride, you also see companies in the more towards the commercial phases in these two platforms. So Netherlands is really particularly strong in indium phosphide and silicon nitride related technologies. Silicon photonics is something which, as a ecosystem within Netherlands, is not a strong point, but we have a very capable partner in terms of IMEC, situated in Belgium, which is one of the knowledge leaders in the field of silicon photonics and as well as CMOS. So Netherlands can possibly also explore the possibility of partnering with IMEC going forward within this PIC landscape. And finally, to come up to the last part of this presentation, what kind of value chain positioning would be essential for a envisioned, let's say, PIC Foundry? What you see is that currently it's really important for application sectors to work or collaborate with PIC producers to develop the demand. The PIC is still in its infancy, like you said, like we mentioned. If you compare that with, for example, electronics, there is a significant gap in terms of demand, and in terms of application, only optical communication is currently the mainstay. If you want to go towards new applications, there needs to be a strong collaboration between PIC producers and PIC application companies to propel the demand for PICs going forward. What that would mean is basically to develop roadmaps together for both PIC producers as well as application companies as well as design houses. What this would look like in practice is that, for example, there is a roadmap coming from an application company, and based on that roadmap, the requirements can be established for PIC Foundry or PIC producers, and what can be realized then feeds back into the application company. And this loop, this collaborative loop, is very essential to make sure there is widespread adoption of PICs going forward, especially in new applications such as sensing. Like we mentioned, currently, it's again optical communication is the mainstay, but what you see is happening more and more is the new potential applications of PICs are resulting in creation of various fabless companies in last years. These companies face challenge in transitioning from advanced research to commercial scale industrialization. And this impacts the company to bring the product to market in terms of time as well as to make it cost efficient. On the other side, what you also see currently is that there is a lack of standardization across the value chain. So if an application company needs to manufacture something on a large scale, it needs to adhere to different standards based on where the chip design is going to happen, where the production is going to happen, and where the assembly is going to happen. And to really propel the PIC industry going forward, standardization will be a key. And to promote the quick turnaround time, which will in turn encourage widespread adoption, we need to provide complete solutions. So from design to assembly to packaging. And this necessitates again a close collaboration across the value chain, leading to importance of offering a solution from a foundry within a one-stop shop perspective. And this you already see happening in practice. For example, a company like Global Semicon partnered with other companies from the chip design as well as chip packaging to offer a complete solution to these fabless companies. And this is what we see is the need of the hour to propel the widespread adoption of PICs from in short to mid-term. So to finally conclude, where do we see a PIC foundry, envisioned PIC foundry for Netherlands? Netherlands PIC foundry, a pure play foundry is expected to be a leading foundry globally with manufacturing capabilities for indium phosphide and silicon nitride PIC platforms, delivering roughly 20 to 35,000 6-inch wafers by 2030. But this foundry should not be limited in terms of scale to only 25 to 30, but it should be dimensioned for higher capacity and wafer size, which will enable to scale in a flexible way in this, let's say, uncertain but rapidly growing PIC market. Another important aspect of this foundry needs to be the advanced PIC integration and packaging. So basically, the Dutch foundry needs to have the capabilities to integrate not only indium phosphide and silicon nitride technologies, but also silicon photonics for that matter. And this integration aspect is expected to this foundry would play a key role in deciding which integration technologies is going to be relevant going forward. With this three-axis kind of a system, there is going to be a strong collaboration across the value chain, and there's going to be a strong synergistic effects derived from this. For example, in terms of cost, in terms of operation, as well as in terms of commercial strategy, like for example, cross-selling. What we expect is this Dutch foundry to be a part of this one-stop shop solution within the regional ecosystem, where you see companies not only knowledge institutes like Twente or Eindhoven, but also chip design companies, application design companies, as well as, for example, a silicon photonics or a CMOS cluster around IMEC. So we expect a strong collaboration in this regional ecosystem, and on top of it, the Dutch foundry would also have a close collaboration with the whole EU PIC ecosystem. So that's basically how we envision this Dutch foundry, and that's the key outcome of our study. This is the end of my presentation. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
All right, thank you very much, Darwin. Thank you so much for this very insightful presentation. I think it was a good overview of the key findings of your study, and I also hope that the people that were watching were able to to absorb all of the information. But as said, we will share with you also a summary of the report afterwards. So there, people are actually still typing some questions. We had some comments that they found this a very nice way of presenting the results. So that's kudos to you,
Thank
Darwin.
you very much.
So there are a couple of questions. So I will start with maybe at the very beginning of your presentation. You mentioned that the most, let's say, conservative scenario is primarily focused on communications, right? And in the B scenario, you also look at the sensing applications, right? You mentioned LiDAR, you mentioned wearables. So how do you see this evolution in scenario B? Do you think the consumer applications will come after the industrial ones, or how do you think it will go?
I think, especially within sensing, to really propel the adoption within consumer electronics, cost will be a key factor. And to achieve cost-efficient designs, you need to have a certain scale. And that scale is primarily then going to be driven by industrial applications first. Yes. So like you see, for example, with LiDAR, we see that catching up quickly. And once you have enough commercialization, enough standardization, that it's really easy to manufacture a PIC like what is currently with a semiconductor.
Yes.
Because especially in consumer electronics, you'll see a lot of fabless companies coming in.
Yeah.
And for that, the industry needs to be at a certain commercial and at a certain scale to really enable these small, or not small, I would say, but these fabless companies to use foundries as a plug-and-play model and not really co-develop with foundries.
Exactly. So it needs to reach a certain maturity that will be reached with industrial applications like LiDAR. Yeah. And maybe coming to LiDAR, you said 80% of that will be linked to the automotive industry. Yeah. We also see maybe some interest from, let's say, agri-food or other applications. Do you have any information on or any insights on that as well?
No, we did not really look that much into other applications, but what we did say or what we did see is that whatever is the automotive will be, let's say, the front runner in a way, because of the lot of stress on autonomous driving going forward. But it won't be too difficult to adapt this application to other applications within the industrial settings, to agri companies, or also one can imagine LiDAR being used in the sorting centers, for example. It won't be too different, but we still believe that majority is going to still be driven by automotive.
Mobility, All right, there's a question also from the audience that came in just now about the cost challenge for packaging. They said when you talk about the challenges for packaging in terms of cost, do you see like what's going to be the different scenarios there? He talks about, for example, optical alignment. So what do you see? What can help overcome those issues? I'm not sure if this is a...
Yeah, so we did not deep dive too much into different technologies. So we of course said we of course looked into different types of packaging. So you have hybrid, heterogeneous, semi-heterogeneous, and monolithic. And we indeed, it's correctly pointed out that right now we see like roughly 60 to 70% of the, not 60, maybe 50 to 60% of the PIC cost comes from packaging. But if you go forward, the more the technology becomes advanced, more you go towards, let's say, maybe not completely front end, but somewhere between front end and back end, so like semi-heterogeneous, you would see that this, the cost will start to go down. The more standardization starts to kick in, the cost of packaging would start to go down.
Yeah, and that's again, you mentioned at the end of your presentation as well, standardization is a very important topic to move the industry forward as well. Definitely. And that's also why I think it's important that industry unites in, let's say, standardization efforts or road mapping efforts in order to make that happen, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So that's also what we're working on together with the IPSR international community. There's a global roadmap that we do with MIT. So maybe also for the people that are watching, you can see the chapters of that roadmap on photonicsmanufacturing.org. And in June, we're going to have another, let's say, spring meeting with all the people that contribute to this roadmap. There's another question that came in from Andres Charles. He says, okay, so data centers and telecommunication is about 1% of global energy consumption. If volume scale as predicted based on silicon nitride PICs, the energy consumption could become a limiting factor. Has that been considered in the study?
No, sadly we did not really look at the energy consumption, not exactly have an idea what kind of energy consumption is going to be required to manufacture these PICs. But I would say, I mean, when we talk about the volume, it's really minuscule compared to semiconductors, for example. So I would not foresee too much challenge in upscaling these manufacturing. And of course, with renewable technologies coming into the picture, I would not foresee a big of a challenge.
And also, I think if you compare still the PIC industry to, let's say, the more mature semicon industry, the electronics, it's still a very big difference in terms of volumes, right? But nevertheless, you mentioned that 2040, $5 to $9 billion dollar market, right? I saw in your slide that half of that is likely to be located in the United States, more or less.
Yeah, in terms of demand, yes.
In terms of demand, right.
Yeah, that's mainly in demand.
Okay. And so when you talk about supply, do you have any insights on that? Like where are these manufacturing hubs are going to be located? Is that...
So what we already see, for example, of course, like United States and China are already taking... starting to invest in PICs, so like the leading, but those are mainly now focused on silicon photonics because it's very easy for a current CMOS player to go into silicon photonics.
Right.
There is less barrier to entry, so that we already see in China and US happening, but there is not much of a pure play foundry setup happening within indium phosphide and silicon nitride, and there we expect Europe and especially Netherlands to take a lead because we really have, let's say, the background, the academic know-how, and as well as the presence across the value chain to really know what is needed. So there we have an edge, and it's not and it's a high barrier to entry if you look at these platforms, and we expect, especially for these platforms, the main manufacturing setup to be focused or concentrated in this region.
All right. So you say that those companies will be more, like, say, virtually integrated and not pure play, whereas Europe, there the opportunity is to really make pure play foundry, and then in the second scenario to have a foundry that covers more than one platform.
Especially on the integration part of it, because like we said, majority of the applications are going to have multiple technologies. So you'll see an indium phosphide combined with silicon photonics or silicon nitride and silicon photonics. So the foundry does not only need to have a manufacturing capability of indium phosphide and silicon nitride, for example, but also play a key role in the integration, really be a technology leader there, because that's what's going to decide the future of PICs.
I see. And so also for the people that are watching and want to know a bit more about the integration part of the story, we have another Delta Dialogues episode only focusing on this topic, where we have different presenters also from IMEC talking about different technologies and the trends that are occurring there. So I invite you also to take a look at our YouTube channel and click on that video. There's another question that came in from Tuan. He says, okay, what do we see for the heterogeneous integrations in surrounding countries? As the Netherlands, we are in a unique position, he says, but how fast are other EU countries in catching up and developing this technology?
Our scope was mainly focused on what's happening in Netherlands within EU, but we see definitely, for example, Germany and Belgium. So you have IMEC there in Belgium. They are one of the front runners in CMOS and silicon photonics, and also they are focusing a lot on integration technologies. And also in Germany, we see a couple of clusters near Aachen and near Berlin, if I'm not wrong, where you see efforts being put in terms of integration. So these two clusters we already see in Europe.
Okay. Also, something that you said earlier was, that in Europe we have a very good position when it comes to indium phosphide, silicon nitride, especially in the Netherlands. Right? Silicon photonics is something that's missing in the picture you mentioned. You mentioned IMEC has a strong let's say expertise on this technology, but it's a research institute, right? So are there any players in Europe that do, let's say, volume or manufacturing of silicon photonics technology, that, as far as you know?
So there are some players. I don't remember the name on top of my mind right now, but
Okay.
we do have, but again, it's either a pilot scale
Yeah.
or a lab scale kind of a setup.
All right.
So we still don't
Yeah.
have a very, and it's
Not like in the
only
United States or in...
so it's mainly on a small scale. We do have small, and we will not call them a pure play foundry. It's more of a like a lab run setup in a way.
All right.
But we do see them not only in silicon photonics but also silicon nitride and indium phosphide.
Yeah.
I think in Germany, Netherlands with Smart, for example. In Switzerland we have a few players. We also see something in France there.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. I think maybe we have time for one last question.
Sure.
I think it's great responses so far. I think the audience will be happy with that. So there's another follow-up question from Tuan again. He said he was asking about heterogeneous integration in other countries, the technology you mentioned.
Yeah.
You mentioned those things. So he says, and what developments do we already see in the Netherlands and our ecosystem to work towards such one-stop shop collaboration? Okay, well that's maybe not a question for you.
Yeah.
But maybe more a question for Photon Delta. So there is a lot of activities ongoing, and especially the National Growth Fund that was awarded last year, April, is a instrument that will allow us to work on this further. So we have been doing a lot of work together with a key partner like IMAC, but also in indium phosphide with Smart and with Ionics for silicon nitride. But now this National Growth Fund allows us to start programs dedicated to integration of these various platforms under the industrialization pillar. So also a call to the viewers that are active in this field and that are working in integration or in one of those platforms, reach out to us, because the program of the National Growth Fund that has a funding of 1.1 billion euros behind it is open also for international companies or organizations to collaborate. So that's just maybe to answer that last question from Tuan. I would like to thank you very much, Darwin, for your time and to come here live in the studio. It was a great presentation, and I think also a good discussion with the audience afterwards. So thanks again, and we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, so then to conclude this episode of Delta Dialogues, if you do have any feedback on the Delta Dialogues episodes or the concept as a whole, you can feel free to scan the QR code that's going to be shown in the screen right now, and you can tell us how we can make this even more valuable to the integrated photonics community. Because in the end, that's what this call is for, right? So every first Wednesday of the month, we try to bring in relevant speakers, relevant topics to engage with you. All right, so then also, if you want to contribute to a Delta Dialogues episode, you can do that. So you can scan this QR code, or you can go to the website photondelta.com and go to the events section where you'll find the Delta Dialogues. You can click on the link and submit an idea of a topic or a speaker that you would like to share with us through a Delta Dialogues episode. So if you have any thoughts there, feel free to reach out to us. And last but not least, we hope to see you also next time. The next first Wednesday of the month is going to be in April, on April the 5th, to be exact. So keep following us on the social media channels and keep an eye on our website, and hope to see you then. Thank you very much, and see you next time.